His name was Danny Casolaro. He was a freelance writer. He wasn't famous like Woodward or Bernstein. He wrote about whatever paid the bills, computer magazines, a book about the Soviet Navy, things like that. But in the late 1980s, he stumbled onto a story so big, so tangled, he gave it a name. He called it the Octopus. He believed he had found a hidden network, a group of men who moved between government intelligence, organized crime, and big business. He thought this group was behind some of the biggest scandals of the era, and he thought they operated with total impunity. In August 1991, Danny Casolaro was found dead in a hotel bathtub in Martinsburg, West Virginia. The room was filled with blood. His wrists were slashed over and over. The police called it a suicide. His family and friends called it murder. They said he was silenced. They said the octopus had finally reached out and pulled him under. So, did a government conspiracy silence Danny Casolaro? The official answer is no. The official story is that a man, overwhelmed by his debts and the pressure of a story he couldn't prove, took his own life. But the official story has holes. Big holes. Holes you could drive a truck through. To understand why this question still haunts people 30 years later, you have to understand the story Danny was chasing. You have to follow the tentacles. It all started with a software company, a small Washington, D.C. firm called Inslaw. The company was run by a man named Bill Hamilton and his wife, Nancy. They had developed a piece of software called PROMIS. PROMIS stood for Prosecutors Management Information System. It was designed to help the Department of Justice track legal cases. It was a powerful organizational tool. The DOJ loved it. They signed a multi-million-dollar contract with Inslaw. But then things went sour. The DOJ stopped paying Inslaw. They claimed Inslaw hadn't delivered what they promised. But Bill Hamilton believed something else was going on. He believed the DOJ was purposefully driving his company into bankruptcy so they could steal his software. He sued the government, and he won. A bankruptcy court judge agreed with him. The judge said the DOJ had stolen PROMIS through trickery, fraud, and deceit. It was a stunning victory for a small company against the full might of the U.S. government. This is where Danny Casolaro came in. He heard about the Inslaw case and thought it would make a good story. It's a simple David vs. Goliath piece. A software company gets cheated by the government. But the deeper he looked, the stranger it got. He started getting calls. People on the inside, spooks and sources, started talking to him. They told him the Inslaw story was just the tip of the iceberg. The DOJ didn't just steal PROMIS to track their own cases. They stole it for something much bigger. This is where the first real tentacle of the octopus appears. A man named Michael Riconosciuto contacted Danny. Riconosciuto was a character straight out of a spy novel. He was a brilliant, eccentric computer programmer. He claimed to have deep ties to the CIA and other covert operations. He was also involved in some very shady business, including drug manufacturing. Riconosciuto was not a simple, clean source. He was complicated and maybe dangerous. But he had a story to tell. Riconosciuto told Danny that he had been hired to modify the stolen PROMIS software. He said he put a backdoor in the program. This backdoor would allow U.S. intelligence agencies to secretly access data on any computer system where the modified PROMIS was installed. The plan, he said, was to sell this bugged version of PROMIS to foreign intelligence agencies and governments around the world. We would sell them a tool to organize their intelligence, and at the same time, we would have a secret key to read all of it. It was the ultimate Trojan horse. According to Riconosciuto, this operation was run by a key figure in the Reagan and Bush administrations named Earl Bryan. Bryan was a businessman and a close friend of then Attorney General Ed Meese. The story was that Earl Bryan used his political connections to help the DOJ get the software from Inslaw. Then, his own companies profited from selling the modified version to other countries. If true, it was a massive conspiracy. It linked a simple software contract dispute to international espionage. But it didn't stop there. Riconosciuto and other sources started connecting more dots for Danny. They said the profits from these illegal PROMIS sales were used to fund off-the-books covert operations. They linked it to the Iran-Contra affair, the scandal where the U.S. secretly sold weapons to Iran to fund anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua. They linked it to the October surprise theory, the claim that the Reagan campaign had secretly negotiated with Iran to delay the release of American hostages until after the 1980 election, ensuring Jimmy Carter's defeat. They also linked it to the collapse of a bank called BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. BCCI was a massive international bank that collapsed in scandal. It was later found to be a primary financial institution for terrorists, drug traffickers, and intelligence agencies around the world, including the CIA. It was a global money laundering machine. Danny started to see a pattern. The same names kept popping up in all these different scandals. It was a small group of men who had worked for the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, or other shadowy government outfits. After leaving government service, they went into private business, but they never really left the world of espionage. They used their old networks to make deals, move money, and operate in the gray areas where law and national security blur. This, to Danny, was the Octopus, a shadowy cabal with tentacles reaching into everything: the DOJ, the CIA, international arms deals, drug money, and political scandals. It was a staggering theory. It was the kind of stuff you see in movies. And for a freelance writer like Danny, it was the story of a lifetime. He quit all his other work. He poured all his money and all his time into the Octopus. He worked on it for over a year. He filled notebooks. He made charts connecting names and events. He was consumed by it, but the story was hard to prove. His sources were spooks and criminals. They would give him a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole thing. They would talk in code. They would hint at dark secrets. One of his key sources was a man named Robert Booth Nichols. Nichols was another one of these shadowy figures, a businessman who claimed deep ties to the CIA and organized crime. He was both a source for Danny and a subject of his investigation. He was a perfect example of an octopus tentacle. Nichols would meet with Danny and give him cryptic warnings. He told Danny he was in over his head. He told him that the people he was investigating were dangerous. "If you continue this investigation, you will die," Nichols allegedly told him. Danny was getting scared, but he was also energized. The threats made him feel like he was onto something real. He told his brother, Tony, about the calls he was getting. Late-night calls with threats. Sometimes just silence on the other end. He told friends that he thought his phone was tapped. He told his family over and over, "If anything happens to me, don't believe it's an accident." He was preparing them for the worst. In early August 1991, Danny told his friends and family he was heading to Martinsburg, West Virginia. It was a small, quiet town. He said he was going there to meet a key source. A source who was finally going to give him the proof he needed. The final piece of the puzzle that would connect everything. He was excited. He told his neighbor to watch his cats and that he'd be back in a few days to wrap this thing up. He didn't seem depressed or suicidal. He seemed like a man on the verge of a breakthrough. On August 10th, 1991, a maid at the Sheraton Hotel in Martinsburg found Danny Casolaro's body in the bathroom of room 517. The scene was horrific. There was blood everywhere. On the floor, on the wall. He was in the bathtub naked. His wrists had been slashed deeply. There were at least 8 major cuts on his left wrist and 4 on his right. The police found a single-edged razor blade in the tub. They also found a half-empty bottle of wine and a can of beer. They found a single piece of paper, a supposed suicide note. It read, "To those who I love the most, please forgive me for the worst possible thing I could have done. Most of all, I'm sorry to my son. I know deep down inside that God will let me in." The local police quickly ruled it a suicide. The case was closed in a matter of days. The coroner's report said the cause of death was exsanguination. He had bled to death. The manner of death was suicide. But from the very beginning, things didn't add up. First, there was the missing briefcase. Danny Casolaro went everywhere with his briefcase. It contained all his notes, his research, his contacts. It was the brain of his octopus investigation. He had it with him when he checked into the hotel. His brother Tony specifically told him to never let it out of his sight. After his body was found, the briefcase was gone. The police searched the room. They searched his car. It was never found. Why would a man about to kill himself get rid of all his life's work? And if he didn't, who did? The police report barely mentioned it. Then there were the wounds. The coroner noted the cuts were deep, severing tendons. Slashing your own wrists that many times, that deeply, is incredibly difficult. Most suicide attempts by cutting involve hesitation marks, smaller, more superficial cuts. Danny's were deep and brutal. Could a person do that to themselves on both wrists? Some experts say it's possible, but highly unusual. There were also witness accounts that the police seemed to ignore. A waitress at the hotel restaurant said she saw Danny in the lounge, talking with another man, possibly of Middle Eastern descent, the night before he died. Another hotel guest said she saw the same 2 men arguing in the hallway. Who was this other man? Was he the source Danny came to meet? The police never identified him, and Danny's mood. Everyone who spoke to him in the days before his death said he was upbeat and excited. He was on the verge of cracking his story. This doesn't fit the profile of a man about to... The suicide note itself was suspicious. It was cryptic and didn't mention his story or his financial troubles, which the police later cited as a motive. The handwriting was confirmed to be his, but the content felt generic, unlike him. The handling of the scene was also strange. The hotel staff cleaned and sanitized the entire hotel room very quickly after the police left, possibly destroying any remaining evidence. And, most disturbingly for the family, Danny's body was embalmed before they had a chance to request a second autopsy. Embalming can destroy certain toxins in the blood, making a more thorough investigation impossible. The funeral home said the local police gave them the okay. The police said they never did. So you have 2 competing stories, the official stories of a desperate man. As Danny Casolaro was in debt. His house was in foreclosure. He had spent more than a year chasing a wild conspiracy theory, a grand delusion, as one government report would later call it. He was running out of money and time. He couldn't prove his fantastic story. His sources were unreliable criminals and con artists. The pressure became too much. He drove to a small town, wrote a note, and ended his life in a hotel bathtub. In this version, the missing briefcase is a mystery, but not necessarily a sinister one. Maybe he threw it away in a fit of despair. The other man in the hotel was just a random person. The threats he reported were just his own paranoia building. Then there's the other story. The story his family and many others believe. Danny Casolaro was not delusional. He was a dedicated reporter who got too close to a dangerous truth. The Octopus was real. This network of former spies and powerful men would do anything to protect their secrets. They had him followed to Martinsburg. They knew he was meeting a source who was about to give him smoking gun documents. Maybe the man he met was a fake source, sent to lure him into a trap, or maybe it was a real source who was also silenced. In this version, these men came to his hotel room, they interrogated him, trying to find out what he knew and who he had told. They took his briefcase with all his research, then they murdered him and staged it to look like a suicide. A very violent, painful suicide, perhaps to send a message to anyone else who might think about digging into their business. The evidence for murder is circumstantial, but it is powerful. The combination of the missing briefcase, the nature of the wounds, the witness of a second man, his repeated warnings to his family, and his upbeat mood right before his death is a lot to ignore. It paints a picture that is hard to dismiss as mere coincidence. After Danny's death, the story didn't completely die. Other journalists tried to pick up the pieces. Congress held hearings. The Inslaw case and the PROMIS software became the subject of multiple government investigations. A report by the House Judiciary Committee in 1992 concluded that the DOJ had in fact mishandled the Inslaw case, but found no evidence to substantiate the wilder conspiracy theories about the bugged software and the Octopus. They looked into Danny's death and sided with the local police, concluding it was a suicide. But the government investigating itself and finding no wrongdoing is not very convincing to people who believe in a conspiracy. For them, it was just the Octopus covering its tracks. Michael Riconosciuto, Danny's main source, was arrested on drug charges just before he was scheduled to testify to Congress about the PROMIS affair. He claimed he was framed to shut him up. He spent years in prison. Bill Hamilton of Inslaw continued his legal battles for decades, never giving up his belief that a deep conspiracy had stolen his software and ruined his company. So what is the truth? After all these years, we are left with questions. Was Danny Casolaro a brilliant investigator on the verge of exposing a secret government, or was he a paranoid man who got lost in a fantasy of his own making? The argument for suicide rests on his financial problems, and the lack of any direct physical evidence of a struggle or a murder. Suicide can be an impulsive act. People who seem happy on the outside can be hiding deep turmoil. The world of intelligence he was exploring is filled with professional liars and manipulators. It's possible his sources were playing him, feeding his paranoia for their own reasons until he simply broke. The argument for murder rests on the mountain of suspicious circumstances surrounding his death. The missing briefcase is the most damning piece of the puzzle. If his research was worthless, why would anyone take it? And if he was going to kill himself, why wouldn't he leave it for someone to find, to continue his work? His death was just too convenient for the people he was investigating. It perfectly and permanently silenced his investigation. Maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. Maybe the Octopus wasn't a formal, organized cabal with a secret handshake. Maybe it was just a loose network of powerful, corrupt men who used their government connections for personal gain. Maybe the PROMIS story was true, but the links to Iran-Contra and the October surprise were just speculation. Maybe Danny had parts of the story right, but not the whole thing. But even a piece of that story could have been dangerous enough to get him killed. He didn't have to have the entire conspiracy figured out. He just had to be a threat to one powerful person. One tentacle of the Octopus would have been enough to pull him under. The story of Danny Casolaro is a chilling reminder of how power works in the shadows. It shows how hard it is to report on the secret world of intelligence, where truth and disinformation are almost impossible to separate. His sources were flawed and his theories were grand, but he was a journalist trying to hold power accountable. He was following a story that led him into the darkest corners of the government, and he ended up dead in a hotel room, with all of his notes gone. The official file says suicide, but the story refuses to die because the questions are too loud. Why was his briefcase taken? Who was he meeting in Martinsburg? Why did he warn his family he might be killed? Until there are satisfying answers to those questions, the suspicion will always remain. The suspicion that Danny Casolaro didn't give up on his story. The story gave up on him, and the people he was writing about made sure he could never tell it. Whether you call it the Octopus or something else, the idea that a group like that could exist and could get away with murder is a terrifying thought. And it's the reason Danny Casolaro's name is still whispered in conversations about government conspiracies and the stories that are too dangerous to tell. His death might have been ruled a suicide, but he has become a martyr for those who believe that some truths are protected by violence and that some reporters die trying to find them.